Hello, everybody. Today we are joined by Professor Loren Brandt at the University of Toronto, a leading scholar on Chinese economic development. Over the years, Professor Brandt has been involved in extensive survey work in both China and Vietnam, while also holding positions and roles at various universities, research institutes, and government forums. Professor Brandt has published widely, and he was notably the co-author for China's Great Economic Transformation, a landmark study on Chinese economic reforms. Professor Brandt, thank you so much for your time.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Right. So I want to start off our conversation by laying the groundwork on this post-reform Chinese growth story. A lot of people point to various different factors for this period of Chinese growth as drivers. Some say productivity growth, some say, mention capital investments, labor upgrades. So I just want to get your view on what were the major factors contributing to this period of sustained Chinese growth, and how has those factors changed according to the demands and the realities of the Chinese economy throughout this period?
Okay, look, I think that's a good question. It's a kind of a question that we can tackle both at the sectoral level or as well as at the aggregate level. And so just let me
Mhm.
kind of begin kind of at the aggregate level. So, we're trying to tell a story about how the Chinese economy has grown from the late 70s, let's just say all to today, so a period that probably spans, 50 years.
Mm.
Want to remind ourselves that if we go back 50 years ago and we're talking about the Chinese economy, this was an economy where it was a primarily rural economy. A high percentage of the labor force happened to be working in agriculture. There was maybe 20% of the population that was living in the cities. They worked in industry. They worked typically in state-owned enterprises. So that was, in some sense, kind of the composition of the economy again during that period of time. If we think about the first 3 decades of reform, this is really very much what I would call a productivity story. So this is a story of where we see rapid productivity growth, but we observe productivity growth that occurs both in individual sectors. So if you thought about the agricultural sector, where a high percentage of the labor force initially was working, with the agricultural reforms, introduction of the responsibility system, we see really rapid growth in terms of the agricultural sector. But we also see dynamism in the countryside through the township and village enterprises, so in the manufacturing sector. So we see productivity growth occurring both in individual sectors, but we also see important productivity growth occurring as people move and are reallocated from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors, as people move from agriculture to industry, as people move with the reforms primarily in the 90s from the state enterprise sector to the non-state enterprise sector. So the work that's been done by myself and by colleagues that try to kind of formally decompose and try to identify the sources of growth that occurred over this period. And so, as you did, you identified a number of things. How important is productivity growth? How important is capital formation and investment? How important is investment in human capital? All of those things, again, in principle, are important sources of growth. But when all is said and done, and we kind of take a look at those first 3 decades of reform, that what we find is that productivity growth is the source of about 2/3 of the growth that we happen to observe over this period of time. So this is an economy that's growing between 8 and 10% a year. So what we have in mind that 2/3 of this is coming from productivity growth. And the productivity growth is coming both kind of within sectors. It's also because of reallocation across sectors. But for our purposes, productivity growth is important in two ways. One, it's going to directly contribute to increases in output. That's what productivity is, how much you can produce from a bundle of inputs. So you got that kind of direct contribution. Productivity growth is also important because in a world of diminishing returns, if you go ahead and if you invest a lot more, high rates of capital formation, all else equal, returns are going to go ahead and decline on the margin to that investment. What that productivity growth through the first 3 decades did is it helped to sustain an unbelievably high rate of return to investment in the economy. And so if we go ahead and if we add kind of the direct contribution of productivity growth and the indirect contribution, that indirect is because it's helping to maintain these high rates of investment in the economy because the returns are high, those two contribute somewhere between 65 and 70% of all of the growth that we observe. Yes, there's some that's occurring because of capital deepening. There's some that's occurring because of these huge kinds of investments that we observe in human capital. So yeah, we want to kind of recognize all of those. We also want to recognize that during this period that because of the demographics, that the dependency ratio is declining. So, in other words, that there's actually a larger percentage of the population that happens to be working. So, the number of workers per everybody else happens to be rising. But clearly, the key thing is productivity growth. And then when we start recognizing how important productivity growth, then we start asking ourselves about, well, what's the nature of the reforms? What is it that allowed and helped contributed to the dynamism that we observe in individual sectors? What is it that contributed to the reallocation of resources from ag to non-ag? And there's just, a long list of reforms. And my own kind of sense is that market liberalization, market opening is just unbelievably important. And that we observe China both carrying out important domestic reforms and liberalization that expanded the role of the market, that increased the autonomy, that better incentivized, individuals. It could be farmers, it could have been, entrepreneurs. So we get all of those kinds of domestic kinds of reforms that are better incentivizing, facilitating resource reallocation across sectors, but we also get this external opening. This external opening is just huge. I mean, in the regard, you open your economy up, both it provides access to new kinds of know-how, there's foreign direct investment, you are able to take advantage of new opportunities outside through exports. You open your economy, you lower your tariffs, increasing competition. Increasing competition has all kinds of benefits for increasing productivity. So we see this kind of from the economic side, all this kind of liberalization that's occurring internally, externally, allowing resources to be reallocated more efficiently, allowing people to be able to move. So now Hukou system gets relaxed in a variety of ways, and people can move from the countryside into the cities. People can move to the interior to the coastal. But what we also want to recognize that there's a lot that's going on kind of politically and in terms of the nature of the political incentives that local officials happen to have as well, that are incentivizing them as well. And so this is a system of where local cadres and officials are incentivized to promote local development and growth. So we have a system where you're being evaluated on how well that local economy under you goes ahead and grows. At the same time, there's certain kinds of decentralization that allows these local governments to retain on the margin, kind of the benefits of the reforms that they are carrying out. So we have both kind of political reform that's incentivizing local cadres to promote development. We have political reform that's increasing competition between localities as well. In addition to the market liberalization, both of those things are just having huge, huge kind of influences, positive influences, on the reform. So people often talk about China as being, oh, it's investment led. China happens to be, export led. I would debate till no end, again, with this kind of perspective. It's really a productivity story, and it's an impressive productivity story. Now, does that mean that this process is perfect? Does it mean that there aren't drags on the development process? Absolutely. There's all kinds of constraints on the development process, but this is a productivity story. And China, in lots of ways, ends up looking like other kind of Asian economies that were also very successful or earlier in their development as well, where productivity and productivity growth was extremely important, to the success. The issue then is if we take a look kind of through the first 3.5 decades of growth, during which China was growing maybe 8.5%, to the financial crisis, through the financial crisis in the last 10 or 15 years, is that what we have seen is that we've seen a marked decline in growth. Now, there's all kinds of debate about the numbers that happen to be out there, about the GDP numbers, that are produced and generated by the National Bureau, of Statistics. So, we can debate that, but even if you kind of take those numbers at face value, what those numbers are suggesting that there's been a really marked decline in terms of the growth that we happen to observe in terms of how rapidly this economy happens to be growing. Even if you take the official numbers, well, before the financial crisis, you're growing at 10%. Official numbers today, 5%. Well, it may actually be that maybe you're not growing at 5%, maybe you're growing at 4%, maybe you're growing at 3%. So there's these kind of fundamental kind of questions that we're trying to kind of get our heads around about why has growth in this economy gone ahead and slowed? And when you do and look at it through the lens of productivity, is that one of the things that you observe is that productivity growth, which has been the source of so much of the dynamism that we had seen through the first 3 decades or so, that productivity growth has effectively disappeared. So productivity growth in China, maybe 0.5% a year, maybe 1% a year at most. So we've gone again from, where productivity growth was very, very high to where productivity growth happens to be very low. And the puzzle here is that if you take a look, in terms of China's development, in terms of where and at what point in China's development this productivity growth has slowed. It's occurring much earlier in China's development relative to, let's just say, its development relative to advanced countries than what we happen to observe in its other Asian counterparts. So there is something that is happening in China at a much earlier point in time. So this decline in productivity growth that begins kind of around the financial crisis, then just carries through for the next, 15, almost 20 years. It is occurring much earlier than what we probably would have expected given China's level of development. And so this is in some sense kind of the $1 million question, like why has this productivity growth gone ahead and slowed? To what extent is it a reflection of things that are happening externally, kind of outside China? Is it the case that productivity growth in the global economy, in the US and advanced countries, is it declining? Or is there something that's going on in China, with respect to China's policy, China's development path that is itself, again, contributing to the slowdown that we happen to observe? That is, in some sense, kind of the $1 million kind of question and kind of the nature of the constraints, political, demographic, geopolitical, that may be kind of constraining China and the level of development and growth that we happen to observe today.
Right. Really interesting. I want to dig a little deeper on from the export angle, which is how a lot of Western media or popular media see China's growth. One in manufacturing, two in exports, and they kind of marry to each other, and kind of bridge this perspective to the productivity growth narrative.
Yeah.
You mentioned a lot. Of the productivity growth coming from people moving from agriculture to non-agriculture sectors, and that unleashed quite a bit of productivity growth. How does export demand shifting from places like Taiwan, from Korea, from Japan, into China, using this cheaper labor force, how did that play a role, and how big of a role was it during this period?
Yeah. That kind of opening up of China,
Hmm.
China being able to take advantage of new kinds of know-how, new kinds of technology, is important to the development that we observe. But one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that even at its peak, exports, if we thought about, okay, well, what's the share of Chinese manufacturing output that happens to be exported? It's probably 20%, somewhere between 20 and 25%.
Hmm.
That means that 70 to 75% of what China's manufacturing sector happens to be producing, it's being sold domestically. So yes, exporting, is important. There's massive amounts of foreign direct investment that come in. It comes in from Taiwan, it comes in from Hong Kong, it comes in from Japan, Korea, I mean, the United States. So there's enormous amounts of foreign direct investment that comes in, during this, period of time. That is, these, firms are investing in China, developing an export platform. There's an awful lot of foreign direct investment that's coming into China whose target or objective is to sell into the economy, is to sell into the domestic economy. That they see this huge domestic market and they say, oh, wow, this is a massive domestic market. We want to be able to take advantage of it. And if you take a look at a lot of leading manufacturing firms, is that their objective was both to use China as an export platform, take advantage of that kind of inexpensive labor initially, but they also saw huge opportunities in terms of being able to go ahead and to sell into a domestic market that was huge and was only going to get bigger as incomes went ahead and rose, with the development process. So my kind of take on is, look, we don't want to neglect the role of exports. We also don't want to neglect the role of imports. Imports were extremely, again, important. They were sources of new technology. Imports were also a source of competition. So here you got foreign direct investment that's coming in, with China's entry into WTO, that entire environment is being relaxed. That's increasing competition for Chinese firms. And I'm a firm believer in the beneficiary effects of competition. So tariffs come down, foreign direct investment, these firms are competing in the domestic market, all kinds of benefits in terms of both knowledge, in terms of knowledge spillovers that are going to be benefiting the domestic, economy. Foreign direct investment was extremely important. It was an extremely important source of export. So as I said, exports probably at their peak, somewhere between 20 and 25% of manufacturing output. Exports by foreign invested firms were probably more than half of that. They probably peaked at 55%, but that's declined significantly over the course of the last 15 years. And today, the role of foreign invested firms in terms of their exports as a share of total exports, it's all the way down to about 30%. So yes, exports are important. Take advantage again of that market, take advantage of all that learning that happens to be going on. But you also want to remember is that the domestic market is huge. Even if we go back to the 2000s, it was the largest car market, largest market for heavy construction equipment, largest market for cell phones. It was huge and provided all kinds of opportunities and competition for learning and know-how diffusion.
Right. You mentioned that the foreign invested firms, they as a share of exports has, gone down significantly. Meanwhile, we do also see a trend of domestic firms, either with the original know-how and via acquisition or FDI, growing larger and being more at that technological forefront, either on the consumer side or in other industries. We see a lot of those firms growing stronger and stronger and exporting more and even investing into those foreign countries more. Usually it starts out in Southeast Asia and then to Latam or Europe, in some case even in North America. So I kind of want to explore that trend a bit more over the past 5 years. In the past 5 years, we've seen a significant increase of outbound direct investment from Chinese firms growing at 6 to 10%. What were the main drivers or the main desires from the case of the Chinese firms in doing that foreign investment into other countries?
Okay. First, let me just kind of go back and my own kind of take is that the work again that we've done in terms of looking at terms of where Chinese exports happen to be going. Throughout much of the kind of the 90s and the 2000s, that a very high percentage of Chinese exports were going to advanced countries. They were
Mm,
going to North America, they were going to Europe, they were going to Japan, they were going to Korea. So very, very high percentage and a lower share that was going to what I would call emerging markets, developing countries. Around the financial crisis, if not before, is that we begin to see a change, that we begin to see that emerging markets are becoming a lot more important. And in part, this is just kind of a reflection of where the capabilities of Chinese firms were. That lots of these Chinese firms could they produce goods that were as good as the very best of the advanced countries? No, they couldn't. They weren't there. But from the perspective of the quality of the products that they were producing, we often talk about the good enough market. They
mm.
were producing products that, in terms of the nature of demand, Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, even Eastern Europe, these were perfect. And so we begin to see shifts again, kind of in terms of where Chinese exports are going. And this was even kind of long before kind of the One Road, One Belt initiatives. A lot of this is just kind of a continuation of a process that has relatively deep roots that's reflective of these growing kinds of capabilities that Chinese firms have gone ahead and acquired. And kind of over time, these Chinese firms, so I'll call them domestic Chinese firms as opposed to the foreign invested firms, they have gone ahead and they've been successful in capturing a larger portion of the export market. There's a really interesting historical parallel here. If you go back 125 years ago, when China opens itself up at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, China was either the second or the third largest recipient of foreign direct investment during this period of time. Most of that foreign direct investment was going into the manufacturing sector. And so, kind of around the time of World War I, if you were to take a look at the percentage of Chinese manufacturing output that was being produced by foreign invested firms, it was extremely high. In fact, it was a very high percentage. But over time, 100% Chinese firms, entrepreneurs entered these same sectors. And by the 1930s, Chinese domestic firms had 70 to 75% of industrial manufacturing output. These firms learned, these entrepreneurs learned, they acquired the capabilities, and they were able to successfully outcompete the foreign invested firms that originally had been the source of much of the know-how and the technology. And so, in some sense, what we're seeing is just a process that we've gone ahead and that we've seen before, that in itself just, it's kudos to Chinese entrepreneurs who are just extremely, again, capable of identifying kind of market opportunities, of learning, diffusing knowledge, building on it, and developing very successful business models. So we see that. Now, in China, that we've also seen over the course of the last 15 years is that we've seen that wages have gone ahead and increased. So the only way that when wages themselves rising are not a problem, in some cases, rising wages just may be a reflection of the fact that productivity is rising and firms and workers are going to be beneficiaries of some of that productivity growth. So if you were to take a look at wages before the financial crisis, on an annual basis, wages were increasing about 11 or 12% a year. This is kind of before, so the 10 or 15 years before the financial crisis, very, very rapid growth. Now, turns out though that wages, although they were growing very rapidly, they were growing less rapidly than what labor productivity was. And as long as, wages are increasing less rapidly than labor productivity, it means that firms are still just making lots of money and profits happen to be rising. Nevertheless, we still, see in China that in some kind of technologies and in some sectors, firms again are facing kind of rising labor cost. You can always go ahead and you can try to innovate. You can try to invest capital deepening to try to go ahead and to try to kind of minimize the cost of those rising labor costs. You can try to move where you happen to be producing. And if you take a look in terms of kind of what's happening in terms of manufacturing output in China, that although that for a long period of time that center of gravity happened to be kind of coastal, we've seen huge increases in terms of investment kind of in the interior. So if we thought about what was going on in terms in Henan and Zhengzhou, with Foxconn, or if we thought about what we've seen, in terms of Sichuan and Chongqing, we've seen again kind of increases in investment kind of in the interior to kind of take advantage of both lower labor costs, but also environments that are relatively good to do business. So yeah, you're always going to do that. But I think the other kind of constraint that Chinese entrepreneurs are facing is that you're often facing, in terms of exporting, you're facing environments that maybe become a little bit more hostile, a little bit more difficult. That tariff protectionism, although we're living in a world in which where these problems were supposed to be minimal, they were still facing all kinds of barriers, all kinds of constraints in terms of their ability sometimes to be able to sell into certain markets. And so it's some combination of both perhaps rising labor costs, rising costs of doing business, in China for any one of a number of reasons, economic, political, but as well as difficulties of being able to export into some of these countries as well, that all of a sudden now that foreign direct investment in these countries looks kind of as a strategy in which to try to kind of try to get around some of these constraints that they happen to have been facing. And this was also true from a policy perspective. I mean, one road, one belt. That clearly again was a strategy of firms, not just private sector firms but also state sector firms as well, especially those that were involved kind of in infrastructure upstream sectors, to encourage those firms to go ahead and to invest in these countries, right? Provide new kinds of opportunities, kind of as both there were economic benefits, but perhaps also as an extension of Chinese soft power, as well. So there's both kind of the economics as well as the politics here that are encouraging these firms to do so. And as since 2016 and the trade wars with the United States, as advanced country markets have become increasingly difficult to be able to sell in, to these firms, they're looking to new opportunities. Yes, you can go ahead and you can do some of it through exporting, but there's a limit in some sense in terms of how much other countries are going to be able or be willing to absorb your exports. And so you're going to be looking for, other opportunities to be able to invest, to be nearer to the market, to be able to better meet market demands and needs. And that's what we're seeing Chinese firms doing. And I expect they'll do even more of it as we move forward.
Right. So just to summarize, two main factors. One, Chinese firms needed a growingly important market in the emerging market sides for the good enough markets. And on the other side, they are also, facing significant barriers that's been raised up over the past 5 to 10 years from the developed market sides. So considering these two factors, we see Chinese firms going to Southeast Asia first, very often as their first camp. How is that region in particular um, a good fit to resolve the constraints that were proposed by these two factors?
I think a lot of it depends upon how these firms want to use these countries in Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
We thought about the way in which Japan and Korea and Korean firms have tried to use, Thailand, Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia, for these purposes. they saw them both as potentially export platforms where
Okay.
labor was relatively less, successful, was less expensive, and they were effectively kind of integrated, kind of lower, more labor intensive type assembly, again, in these countries with more capital intensive, skilled labor intensive manufacturing of intermediates kind of in the home country. So
Mm,
they were trying to utilize them in that way. They didn't look to them all that much in terms of their domestic market. You began to see a little bit more if we look, for example, at the auto industry, in Thailand. That was an industry where Japan had invested heavily. Japan or Japanese firms had significant portions of the market. Korean firms went ahead and followed later. And in fact, we actually see Chinese car producers again looking, to Thailand as a potential market as well. So I think a lot of it's going to depend upon the firm. It's going to depend upon the sector that they happen to be, involved in. That these countries are going to be providing opportunities, both perhaps for lower labor cost and for allowing them to kind of integrate these countries in more labor intensive assembly and into their global value chains. But it may also kind of, given the size of these countries, I mean, Vietnam is a country that has a population that's pushing probably 80 million. There's a relatively significant, domestic market, still small by comparison to the size of the Chinese market, but it's still, again, significant to get the attention of firms. And even the same thing with respect, to India. I mean, India, huge country. Bangladesh, huge country. So there are countries there that are huge, that are perceived where there's potentially just huge domestic markets that these firms may be able to take advantage of. And it's always not kind of either or. It's not always, well, I'm going to service that market through export, or I'm going to service through, uh, producing again locally. Sometimes it can be a bit more complicated where there may be some things you may do in that country, other things more upstream, more capital intensive, more skilled labor intensive you may do, in China and integrate, production in those countries downstream with what you're doing upstream again in your home country. So I think there's all kinds of strategies that firms again can follow, and a lot of it kind of depends upon both, their ability to be able to capture domestic market and in some sense their need to be able to take advantage of lower labor costs kind of downstream. I can help make their retain the competitiveness of their products, even if they end up, exporting from there, to advanced countries.
right. Just to close our conversation off, on a note of Chinese policy, you mentioned One Belt, One Road. That has been in place for the better part of 10 years now. But we have only seen, a drastic rise in this outbound investment over perhaps the past 5 years. So I just kind of want to get your take on this divide between state strategic support on various different industries going abroad versus private outbound expansion, seeking that additional export platform as well as additional market. I want to get your take on how does those two interact or perhaps compete with
Look,
each
and
other.
I think these are good questions, and just I have not seen an awful lot of work that in some sense has tried to quantify carefully the magnitudes. So
Right.
that there's a little bit of work again that's been done trying to kind of quantify over the last 10 or 15 years China's overseas foreign direct investment. We
Mm,
know initially a lot of that was occurring through state, kind of state-owned enterprises and through the big state groups. We know an awful lot of that was kind of natural resource related, in
mhm,
that regard. Much less, again, kind of information on this, what I would call kind of private, capital, that happens to be moving. And I haven't seen, again, up to this point, really good studies that are kind of quantifying kind of the magnitudes. Although I think in general, kind of the state-led one was the one that was dominant. My sense is that the private is becoming slightly more important.
mhm.
And it's hard for me to say again at this point, kind of what the relationship may be between the two, and kind of moving forward, how the extent to which they may become much more similar, or we may see again differences continue.
Right. And when you're going through these literature, what do you think is the main hurdle or the main barrier for us to have an accurate grasp
Yeah.
of?
I think the main issue, it's a data issue.
Okay.
Having spent, having done, work, on big state-owned enterprise groups and kind of spent time trying to kind of work on kind of the changing kind of configuration of these big groups. As part of that we went ahead and we were able to kind of capture all of the kind of the domestic investment of these big state-owned enterprise groups. and we're able to pull together data on their overseas investments. Now, there is not, I mean, sources that are easily accessible that's going to allow one to be able to go ahead and to have year by year by year by year enormous amounts of detail. But there are a number of, institutes that have been collecting methodically, kind of very labor intensive, trying to kind of capture all of the overseas investments that have been made, by China, probably over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. And so there's a number of efforts that have been made. Those data sources now, we integrated those data sources. There's much less information on some of the private sector investment that happens to be going on. So a lot of it is a data issue. You have maybe estimates of kind of what's going on in terms of the aggregate
Hmm.
at a very detailed level. Who are the firms? What are the sectors? What are the countries? We have much, much less information there. And so we don't know exactly how well they're doing. We don't know how their operations overseas are integrating or being integrated with their domestic operations. And these are, in some sense, kind of big questions. And they would be ultimately kind of revealing of the motivations that this overseas investment may have and what the implications may also be for the Chinese economy. So if you thought about, the experience of some of the Japanese and the Korean firms who at various points in time where much more of their investment has been outside of Korea, it's been outside of Japan, probably economic reasons for doing that, political reasons, geopolitical reasons for doing that. What are the larger implications? Who are the true beneficiaries of this overseas foreign direct investment? How much of those benefits go back to the domestic economy? These are really important, questions, certainly in terms of what the implications are in terms of for both of these countries in terms of being able to sustain growth, as we move forward. And these are questions I'm sure that we're going to be asking about in the case of China as well, as this overseas foreign direct investment continues. Who are the beneficiaries? Of it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was very insightful, and have a great day.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed
Thank you.
talking with you.